Know that you've been invited into that room for a reason. So just show up and be your authentic self.
You're only going to do great science if you're really happy and if it fits in your life.
It's also good to learn from the other people that you're working with.
In the long run, it's very satisfying, but it is a uphill battle. And the only thing that sort of keeps you going is the mentors and allies and friends and collaborators that you meet along the way.
Hey folks, Jeff Kozlowski here with another episode of The Next Step, a very special episode of The Next Step. I am a senior marketing strategist here at SMD, and typically what we do on this podcast, we have on SMD graduate school alumni, and they come on and they talk about their career journeys and give great advice to our current graduate school trainees. Today, we're sharing a recent episode of Neuroscience Perspectives, which is a podcast produced by the Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience. Typically on that show, John Fox, the director of the Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience here at University of Rochester, picks the brains of world-renowned neuroscientists as they visit the university. They talk about how they got into science, they give a closer look at their research, and they provide any advice for aspiring scientists and graduate students. So one of their latest episodes actually fits perfectly with the next step because it's a mashup of some of the best pieces of career and grad school advice from these world-renowned neuroscientists. So if you're thinking about how science might fit into your life and how you might fit into the field, this episode is for you. The list of guests in order of appearance can be found in the show notes. Special thank you to the Neuroscience Perspectives crew for letting us air their latest podcast on our channels. Super excited about it and think our graduate trainees and prospective trainees will really get a lot from it. So please enjoy.
What's your advice to a young graduate student charting a path for themselves?
Be honest to yourself and know whether you really love what you're doing. Nothing good comes out of doing something for an outcome, for the PhD, for the MD, for the this or that. If you love the doing of it, the process, it will never feel hard. Even if that reward at the end gets to be a moving target, which usually it is. If you love the doing of it, if you walk into your lab or to your office and you sit down thinking, something good is going to happen today, or I have to get through this so that I can do something else that I'm really looking forward to. If you're honest to yourself and you don't force yourself to do something because you or somebody else has an expectation of you to behave or perform or do something else, you're going to be happy, and it will come with a lot of good things.
I got advice from an old mentor long ago who said, if you're really interested in something like neuroscience, you should do something outside of neuroscience to see if you like it, right? And so I did that. And orthopedics, it was unusual. I was like, I'd never be interested in the bone. I'll do orthopedics.
Yeah.
And it actually turned out to work out really well.
When maybe you and I were coming up through the system, you became an expert in a very specific domain and that. And today, you really have to start to work across disciplines.
It's harder for sure. And in neuroscience now in particular, because what you could possibly do with the range of tools that has emerged, the expectation for a high profile paper is that it's going to have a little bit of everything. And how could you do all that? So I think it becomes more important to work as a team and to have different people in the group that, you see more co-first author or even three all gave the same amount of effort to the paper going on. But it's also good to learn from the other people that you're working with.
The thing I try to do is just always know your stuff, bring some scholarship along, but just look at it with really open eyes, curiosity, look at it for what's out there, is this question everything. So I think, it doesn't always work, but it kind of helps you getting, stuck in fashion corners of the field.
Yeah,
I think.
Absolutely. So, and then projecting out, if you were giving some advice to the younger, obviously you do this all the time with your graduate students and trainees and that, what do you say to them about that, getting unstuck or framing out the questions in a way that will make them meaningful and important?
Yeah, I sometimes feel for people in my lab because I really push them hard to make their own decisions and really to think like, is this really interesting to you? Do you care about this? Do you what do you think's gonna how is this gonna change the way you think about things? Is this gonna change our understanding of things? I really try to operate at that very basic low level where I think things are really important. So I really try. And I think, there are many ways to be a successful mentor, but sort of my approach is really to try to help each individual find meaning and joy and their own, pathway of the balance of productivity for themselves. So I try not, I'm not one of those things like everyone has to do this every month and here we do, it's all very
more organic,
it's kind of
and
intense
holistic.
and organic,
Working on personhood as well as just this is the great project
and
to do
not
or
just
something.
the person as a scientist, but the whole person. I mean, I think you're only going to do great science if you're really happy and if it fits in your life.
You've had an extraordinary career. I mean, you really, really have. And looking back on the things that happened and the people that you met, has it given you a sense for the path to success? And if you were to take that and turn it into advice for a youngster today, you have some pearls of wisdom. We always ask this question.
Right. Yes, well, the world is changing dramatically, so I feel like I'm a bit dated already. Serendipity has been a big part of this. I started my lab out of graduate school from UCSF, went back to Japan. It was not something that I had imagined doing, but they were launching a new institute, the Riken Brain Science Institute.
Yeah.
And the goal was to create something more Western, not the traditional hierarchical system of Japanese university. And I thought, well, who am I? I'm just starting out, and I had a lot of interesting ideas, I thought, for the research, but was just untested.
Right.
But I felt that I could bring the kind of Western infrastructure or ecosystem to a new institution. And in that way, felt like I could contribute right away, in addition to eventually science.
Yeah.
That was a very, very lucky break. I was, of course, anxious about doing that, but excited at the same time. It was an institution that had no tenure. It was on a 5-year review cycle.
Right.
And the challenge was there, also moving far from the familiar. But chances come around very rarely. And so I think my advice would be, if a young person had an opportunity, they shouldn't be afraid.
Yeah.
And
Seize the day.
Seize the day.
Right. For youngsters up and coming, you've traveled a certain path, from an immigrant family and the humanities and so on. When you turn around and you talk to your graduate students, or even if you're out in the school system, what do you say to youngsters? What do you say about, do you have some nuggets, tips for life?
For life, oh wow.
Or the academy.
It's interesting because I was not by any means a traditional success story. I think it took a long time for me to get off the ground. I mean, in terms of, I was a postdoc for something like 7 years, which may be more typical nowadays, just a larger commentary on academia in general. But, I didn't think that I would succeed in this career path. There was no indication I would for many, many years. I struggled. I didn't get my first faculty position until, about 10 years ago. It's a lot of investment that you put in, not sort of knowing what will come out the other end. But, and people will give you all kinds of advice, but it's kind of the survivorship bias. Like, this worked for me. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll work for anybody else. But one thing that I found that I couldn't move away from was this kind of like, I have a unique perspective, and I'm just going to keep doing the thing that I think needs to be done, whether it's looking at spontaneous brain activity when nobody else cared about that, or whether it's looking at certain populations using certain approaches. I have a unique perspective, and I'm going to be here, and I'm going to bring that perspective to academia, whether they want it or not.
Yeah.
And it turns out eventually they do want it because sometimes if you're not from the majority group, you don't see anyone else that looks like you. You think, well, I'm the odd one out. I must be wrong. But the truth is, that as we've talked about, the diversity is what drives the innovation in science. And so when you stick it out, you stick to your, try to bring people along, I guess, to your perspectives. In the long run, it's very satisfying, but it is a uphill battle, and the only thing that sort of keeps you going is the mentors and allies and friends and collaborators that you meet along the way who support you in that path. So there's both sort of don't lose your hope, even though it sometimes looks bleak, but also rely on those friends and connections and collaborations, because that's what makes it all possible and worthwhile.
A lot of our PhD graduates now choosing not the academic route, choosing to walk away from the research enterprise. And of course, there's a big sucking sound as the big data firms, the Googles, the Facebooks, take the PhD students that would formerly have gone down that route into their more corporate world. Are you worried about that? And what would you say to a youngster looking at that fork in the road and saying, I could go over into this corporate world and make a lot of money, let's face it, or should I stay in the academic track? Is there something that we should be saying to somebody to say, look, stay the course? It's worthwhile.
Academic research, is fantastic. Who can have a better job than what we do, right? I mean, we wake up every morning, and our goal is to come and think about, what are the next question we want to. So there's no other job that offers you this. So that's one. So I think personally, what I feel is that, what I tell students is that if you feel that this is something critical for you, and you have this drive inside yourself. You don't have, to come and then, what do I do today? I don't know what I'm going. So if you come, every day and you get to the lab and you have all this thing driving you, that means that you have something inside you that is done for science, right? That's one thing where you should, because you need to have that. If you don't have that, probably you're not at the right place, because you need that, because we know what the cons are, right? It's competitive. There is a lot of people. There is a ton of people who will go after the same, funding that you will be doing. But there is place for you if you have that. Yeah. And then, of course, after that, you need to take this and take advantage of that. Take your career. You need to take your career in your hands and moving forward. You need to take the lead on your career, right. and go with it positively, and surround yourself with a good team of people, taking advantage of the resources that your graduate program offers you, making a network, talking with people. You need to develop network. So you need a lot of things that you need to yourself to take care of. But if you do that, people will be pleased, and excited to give you and train you and help you advancing that. Yeah. But you need to take the lead on your own career, and you need to have this motivation. If you have that, there's no reason why you should not, you should not succeed. There is place for you in research. I mean, that would be my thing.
Have you picked up a specific mentoring style yourself? Is there something that you bring, or that you'd say this is a key component?
I think, thus far in my experience, so I've been at Yale for 14 years or so. Every student is different, right? And I think if I have a mentoring style, it might be mostly centered around being very patient, trying to be very, very tolerant of the differences between other people, how their styles might interact with others in the lab group or with me. I try not to impose too many of my own, the expectations I had for myself. I try not to impose them on my students, because their style and their learning style might be different from mine, or their goals in life might be different from mine. So
I love that answer. I often get asked the same thing, and I say, people in a lab are just human beings, like the human beings in your world, in your life, and they come in all shapes and sizes, and you have to figure out a way to fit around that. And
everybody has a real life too, and it isn't science 100% of the time, although sometimes it is. I have trouble turning off the science in my head. But people come to the lab and they have had a bad day, or they have, a family crisis, or something else is more important that day than, this one experiment. And, that's a real thing. It's not just science, it's also everybody's real life too.
You've had an amazing life, really. You've reached the absolute pinnacle of the academy from a small town in Virginia. When you talk to your graduate students or youngsters in the schools, and they say, like, how do I do it? How do I do what Brian Boyd did? Do you have some pearls of wisdom for them? Is there advice for them?
Yeah, I guess 2 pieces of advice. For me, and I think for other people in the field that I've interacted with as well, mentors are really important. Find your supportive mentoring network. And sometimes you need mentors for different reasons. Sometimes it's not just about the science. Sometimes it's just about navigating academia. When I was in my doctoral program, one of my mentors was a Latina woman. And I talked to her about what it's like being a minority in the academy. And those are the conversations we had. But they were really important for my career. And so find your mentoring network, that support. The other I would say to people, and I often hear this from students who are from marginalized backgrounds, this whole concept of imposter syndrome. And I feel like I'm an imposter. And I would say that, again, most people I've talked to in the academy, at some point in their career, felt like an imposter. So know that you've been invited into that room for a reason. So just show up and be your authentic self. So those are my 2 pieces of advice.
As somebody who's really had a fantastic career, what's that one pearl of wisdom? What do you say to them? What's going to get them through?
Yeah, so single pearls are always a problem for me.
We have 1 minute. You can do 5.
But I think one might be to identify not a problem right this moment that you want to attack that's important, but what would give your entire career in its inevitable arc meaning and importance, so that if you got there, you would have felt fulfilled. And to some of us, that has some sort of highfalutin kinds of words like changing the world or discovering things that will help large classes. To some people, it might be equally important, but to answer this question that's always been unknown. And if you have that, I think the complexities of life become just steps toward that fascinating goal. And that might be toward human health, toward the betterment of the world, or maybe just discovering the subatomic forces that explain black holes.
Just that.
Just that.
Okay, we're joined now by Dr. John Fox, who you saw several times throughout that episode. He's the director of the Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience and professor of neuroscience here at University of Rochester. John, thanks so much for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. So first, can you just talk a little bit more about neuroscience perspectives? I think folks watching that got a sort of a preview, but there's a lot more to that podcast than just, career advice and that sort of thing. So, what was the idea behind starting the podcast, and then what can folks expect if they want to listen to more episodes?
Yeah, well, originally the idea was just, we realized we have like some of the most famous scientists on the planet coming here to town in Rochester. And of course, when they come to town, they speak to a relatively select group of people who are experts in their field and so on. So, they come to give a seminar, and we're just like, we're not getting the value out of this. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we could learn a little bit more about these people rather than they're super specialized, they're working in the molecular soup or some little piece of a problem. Who are they? What are they about? What drives them? How do they get into science? Did they come through the classic academic route, or did they did they have a strange circuitous story? Are they an immigrant, an emigrant? What are those stories? And also, these people are the most successful people in neuroscience for a good reason, right? They're special people. They're driven people. So maybe to try and unlock a few of those secrets too. Like what's the advice for young scientists out there, young trainees, graduate students, high school students? So that was a big part of it, and so we gave it a try. I think we originally thought we'd do 2 or 3 episodes, and see how that goes. And I think we're well into the 20s now, and we intend to keep on going. They're a lot of people consume them, and they seem to have a real impact on people.
John, I know you talked to a lot of people over the last 20 or so episodes. Was there, sort of, you mentioned that not everybody, started thinking they wanted to go into neuroscience, and the variety of backgrounds is amazing that these people have. But is there one quality, that you saw or heard about in these interviews that eventually led these folks to set themselves apart and become world-renowned neuroscientists?
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but I actually came to the US not for science, but on a track and field scholarship. So I'm just a dumb jock actually, and I've mentioned that a few times in the podcast over the years. And one of the things when you grow up in Europe, for example, the education system's superb. I got a great education as a youngster, but I had studied English and history in university. And what happens is when you go from secondary school or high school to the university, at that moment in time, you actually pick what it is you're going to do. So I was 16 years of age, and I was picking, English and history and the Irish language to take on as what would ultimately lead to my career. What's great about the American system is you still have this flexibility. You go to college and you've got a couple of years, to really sort of figure out where you're going to go. So you're much more mature when you do that. And you can also flip from one discipline. You could start out being a pre-med student and then say, oh, you know what, I think I'll actually, I'd like to go over here and study a bit more in politics. And you have that flexibility built into the system. I think it is absolutely the best thing about the US undergraduate system. So when I got here, I was able to pick up science late in life, relatively later life, in my 20s, really my mid-20s, and turn myself into a scientist. And I like telling those stories to youngsters, because sometimes people feel like they're in their lane and they need to stay in their lane. And I say to them, you know what? Look at these folks. Many of them came from completely different backgrounds. So you'd sort of ask, well, what is there a distinguishing characteristic? Yeah. The reason I mention track and field is what I noticed in people who went on to be, great athletes, great sports people, was a certain level of drive. It's like this kind of singular focus on being excellent. It's a work ethic that comes along with it. It's understanding that there's not a lot of glory in the day-to-day training routines, those hours that you have to put in, but that the glory will come down. It's sort of a temporal discounting. The glory is down the road. But if you do all the work and you do all the practice and you stay at it, and your horizons are in years, not days or weeks or months or minutes, but in years, you're very likely to have a success. And I've really noticed that actually in a lot of the guests on Neuroscience Perspectives. They remind me of Olympic athletes.
All right, so John, that we could probably wrap it up on that note, but I wanted to ask you yourself. We heard from so many distinguished guests in the neuroscience field in that episode on their career advice, but let's hear from you now. What would you say to a graduate trainee or someone looking to break into this field in particular, or just going through their graduate training and needing some guidance as they either finish out their last few years or whatever position they may be in?
This is a question I often get asked, and of course I always ask it on the podcast, on our video blog, which is how do you mentor? What's the key to a good mentor-trainee relationship? What really produces that magic that allows somebody to get a great PhD? And it's a two-way street. And so, from the student side, what I would say is an absolutely crucial thing is your personal chemistry with that individual. It can be professional. We're not talking, you don't have to be best friends or anything, but it has to be a working relationship. And like I say, sometimes people will ask me, well, how do you develop that? And I've trained over 35 PhD students through my lab. And I always say the same thing, which is when you've had one graduate student and you've developed a good working relationship with one graduate student, that's what you've done. You've developed a good working relationship with one graduate student. And when you start the next one, it will be a different working relationship because humans are humans. And it's just like everyday life out there. You have relationships with a whole variety of different people that you have to figure out how to approach them and how to interact with them. And those are unique dynamics. So there's this flexibility that needs to be there so that you can meet the moment with a given individual. People are different. We're often working across large age gaps and different ethnic backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds. And so you have to be able to meet people in the middle and understand each other and be gentle and kind to each other. So that's the first thing that's super important. And what I often say to beginning graduate students is, if you're going into a lab, it's fine. It's great if that person is a super famous scientist and hard driven and producing wonderful work in top journals and all that kind of stuff. But go talk to the former trainees. Find out what the culture in the lab is like. Find out what it's like there. Is this one of those labs that chews up and spits out people? And yes, some people are successful there, but they're successful despite, I don't want to say toxic culture, but despite, difficulties and interpersonal stuff and overdriven and all the things that go along there. Because you have to ask yourself, is this what I want to commit the next 5 to 7 years of my life to? So those are really important points. Do your research first, be flexible, and find somebody kind and generous to work with, so that the next 5 or 7 years of your life are not going to be a misery.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time. And thanks again to the Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience for letting us share this episode on our channels. If you're interested in more of Neuroscience Perspectives, be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to the latest episode of the Next Step podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share with other members of the University of Rochester community or anyone you think could benefit from these career stories. And we wish you nothing but the best in your own career journey. Until next time.